Welcome to this Georgian Group online lecture. My name is Rosemary Yallop and I'm going to be sharing some thoughts on the architectural picturesque. The phrase Georgian architecture perhaps immediately brings to mind buildings like these. Elevations of geometrical precision, sometimes to the point of austerity, punctuated by symmetrical fenestration. External decoration tending to the restrained, but nearly always incorporating the orders in the form of columns or pilasters ornamented with capitals of varying degrees of intricacy. This combination of precision, symmetry, simplicity and restraint creates a harmonious whole which not only pleases the eye, but soothes rather than challenges the human mind, and that is probably a large part of why we instinctively enjoy this particular architectural idiom. The interior plans for such houses, both large and small, echo the regularity of the external elevations. Largely symmetrical, with principal rooms leading off a central vestibule or staircase hall. The classical country house usually located its principal rooms on a raised ground floor over a semi-basement service floor, and therefore announced its entrance with a substantial flight of steps from ground level, perhaps under a portico or pediment as a central focal point. Whether hidden behind a parapet or on view, the roofline was generally plain. Paradoxically, while we now consider it quintessentially British, this style was largely derived from models provided by ancient Greece and Rome. Andrea Palladio's Renaissance reinterpretations of antiquity were hugely influential in early Georgian Britain, and from the mid-18th century it became an essential part of the education of British architects to travel to continental Europe to study the classical antiquities of Italy and Greece, which they observed, measured and minutely recorded, and then used as templates, sometimes literal ones, for their designs. This classical tradition was beyond question central to much of Georgian architecture, but it is not the only idiom to be found in the long Georgian period, for in the realm of domestic architecture, and the smaller country house in particular, another design perspective was emerging in the last quarter of the 18th century to challenge the classical canons, and that was the architectural picturesque. The term picturesque describes an aesthetic concept which developed in the late 18th century and was hugely significant for its influences on art, on landscape gardening, and on architecture. Architectural historian David Watkin identified it as the major English contribution to European aesthetics. In more down-to-earth terms, Nicholas Pevsner described it as the first feeling your way theory of art in European history. It's a complex concept whose origins lie in the 18th century philosophical debate about the nature of beauty, and it came to embrace landscape design, art and literature, as well as architecture. The philosopher Edmund Burke published an analysis of the nature and types of beauty in 1757, analysing the process by which the eye and the mind perceived beauty and examining the concept of taste. He proposed a binary division of aesthetics between the beautiful, which derived from symmetry, the harmony of repeating forms, and qualities of smoothness, which the brain finds fulfilling and reassuring, and the sublime, which was a quality of wildness, a sensation beyond words, reminding the onlooker of his smallness in the face of nature's power, but also arousing a thrilling frisson of horror. But a third aesthetic category was later put forward, that of the picturesque. A country vicar, the Reverend William Gilpin, toured Britain in the later 18th century, sketching scenery that he described as picturesque, publishing his notes and sketches for a keen amateur audience. He defined a picturesque view, or object, as one which possessed that peculiar kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture, a definition which unhelpfully raises more questions than it answers. Other major figures who shaped the public debate about the application of picturesque theory to architecture and landscape through their writings were Richard Payne Knight and Udale Price, wealthy border country squires and cultivated men. As applied to architecture, the central proposition of the picturesque was a shift from rational, measurable, cerebral ideas of beauty, which classical architecture was believed to embody, to the primacy of pictorial values. An object or shape which might not be regarded as beautiful according to the contemporary rules could take on a different type of beauty if artfully placed in a pictorial composition, and all the more so if it was evocative, reminding the onlooker of another country or another era. Picturesque buildings made a calculated impact on the viewer. It was the architecture of effect. It had a theatrical quality. It was architecture as make-believe, scene setting, and there were really no rules. Beauty lay in the eye of the beholder. In the context of domestic architecture, it was revolutionary. In the 1770s, Richard Payne Knight built for himself Downton Castle, not the first country house to be built in an unconventional style, but perhaps the first consciously to embody what he called the mixed style which characterises those buildings seen in the paintings of Poussin or Claude. Built piecemeal during successive ages, distinguished by no particular manner of execution, but admitting of all promiscuously. Downton was designed by him to look as if it had grown over time, added to as fortunes waxed and functionality changed. This underlines the central paradox of the picturesque. The more an air of naturalism was desired, both in landscape and in buildings, the greater the degree of artifice required to produce it. The picturesque architect employed the same process of conscious fabrication and arrangement of subjects as did the artist in painting a picture. Picturesque architecture came to triumphant expression in the long Regency period, when its most skilled practitioners included architects such as John Nash, Geoffrey Wyatville, and Anthony Salvin, as well as landscape designer Humphrey Repton. I mention Repton because he was also a theorist of the picturesque in landscape and in architecture, and published on it at length. One of the tenets of picturesque country house design was the unification of house and setting. There had to be a sympathetic congruity between the form of the house and the nature of its landscape. The whole was intended to be as pretty as a picture. We can see at once not just a variety of stylistic idioms, materials and decoration, but above all the sheer irregularity of these houses, scarcely an axis of symmetry to be seen. Shapes such as cylinders, cones and cubes were assembled or massed in new and surprising ways, like a child's building blocks, to create complicated effects of light and shade, airiness and solidity. And often the most striking element, and intentionally so, was the roofline, rising and falling against the sky, designed to astonish and to be visible rather than hidden. In the picturesque house, this irregularity extended to the plan. For one thing, the raised ground floor of the classical house tended to be done away with, in favour of unifying the floor level with the ground outside, promoting a dialogue between interior and exterior. For the picturesque country house was not only to be looked at from the outside, but looked from to the outside. Humphrey Repton wrote that there is no subject connected with landscape gardening of more importance or less attended to than the window through which the landscape is seen and which admits the landscape to the house. The main entrance was no longer necessarily the principal focal point of the exterior, and sometimes was not even particularly obvious, further emphasising informality. Picturesque houses often had loggias or conservatories, the latter evolving from being a detached orangery to an integral part of the house, used not merely for displaying plants of high value, but as a polite room in its own right, and most importantly, a liminal space between indoors and outdoors. And the loss of the semi-basement meant that as a consequence, the service quarters, now on the same level, were banished to wings extending behind and out of sight, adding to the irregularity of the plan, and often screened from view by picturesque planting. The rigidity of the classical plan gave way to the looser, flowing informality of the picturesque house, itself reflecting changes in country house life and the growing enthusiasm for villa retreats, a phenomenon inextricably linked with this new approach to domestic architecture. We've just had a glimpse of the spectrum of picturesque styles which evolved. Where did architects look for picturesque inspiration? For one thing, they looked to British history, secular and ecclesiastical, with allusions to ancient abbeys, castles, Tudor manor houses, as well as the vernacular of the Old English cottage. John Nash experimented successfully with variations on the domestic castle, some with greater stress on historical derivation, such as those at Knepp and Killymoon, and others more interpretative, such as Luscombe, a collaboration with Humphrey Repton, a house which was essentially a villa or smaller informal country house, clad as a castle. The Tudor and Jacobean eras were also fertile ground. Mamhead, designed at the end of the Georgian period by Anthony Salvin, is a Tudor Gothic reframing of an earlier house, with a stable block in the form of a Norman castle. The slightly earlier Panshanger, by Samuel Wyatt and William Atkinson, combines both Tudor Gothic and ecclesiastical Gothic in a Repton landscape. The cottage ornée was gaining favour from at least the 1780s, combining free form with a fashionable, romanticised fascination with bucolic life. Geoffrey Wyatville, in collaboration with Humphrey Repton, built Ensley, a lavish example for the Duke of Bedford in around 1811, a playful make-believe of a rustic English cottage, in keeping with its surrounding romantic scenery, but on a grand scale. But architects also looked abroad. Italian rustic buildings and Indian pavilions were all legitimate elements of this new approach. Simultaneously with his domestic castles, John Nash was responsible for a novel, vernacular Italianate model, which was based on the Italian rustic buildings to be seen in the middle ground of painters of the Italian landscape from the 17th century, such as Poussin and Claude. Just as Payne, Knight and Price had recommended, their asymmetry gave the impression of buildings which had grown organically over time, and Nash echoed this idea by assembling elements of square and round towers and including contrasting vertical and lateral elements to produce an irregular but charming whole, not a copy, but a reinterpretation. His first essay on this style was at Cronkhill in Shropshire of 1802, followed by Sandridge Park in Devon. Contemporaneous with Nash's Sandridge Park was Samuel Pepys Cockerell's Season Coat, which, although Samuel had never visited India himself, was designed in a loose Mughal style, incorporating classical elements, for his nabob brother Sir Charles to remind the latter of his sojourn in India, which had generated the wealth required to build it. This is consciously evocative architecture. The picturesque concept and its legitimising of asymmetry gave architects freedom to play with shapes in an expressive way, which did not in itself dictate a particular use of materials or external form or decoration, which was left to personal vision or taste. So the picturesque was not a specific style, but an approach to design, or in the phrase used by historian Christopher Hussey, a point of view. Architects did not have to opt for one approach over the other, and some showed perhaps surprising Catholicity. And of course, the picturesque did not oust the neoclassical in country house design. The austere beauty of Greek revival Belsae Hall, designed by Sir Charles Monk as his own house from 1806, is contemporaneous with Nash's Jacobean Longner Hall. And while William Wilkins was building the Tudor-Beathan revival Tregothnan in 1816, Charles Robert Cockerell was remodelling Oakley Park in a conventional neoclassical idiom, for instance. But the picturesque enjoyed a sustained period as a very credible alternative approach for the country house, and indeed increasingly for the smaller villa. This was architecture not grounded in learning or connoisseurship. Instead, it was playful and high-spirited. The mission of the picturesque aesthetic was, as Richard Payne Knight wrote in his influential poem The Landscape, to charm the eye and captivate the soul. This unserious, unacademic nature was one reason why picturesque architecture was later so reviled by high Victorians and such influential figures as Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who loathed its dishonesty and superficiality, preferring what he saw as the truth of meticulously accurate translations of medieval Gothic architecture. And it is undeniable that the picturesque could become ridiculous if taken to extremes or executed as an over-literal copy of an historic or exotic style rather than interpretation, and especially when used for the smaller house and in the hands of what we will tactfully call less sensitive architects or even the speculative builder. But less radical and more polite forms, such as the vernacular Italianate villa, pioneered by Nash and then copied far and wide, could with skill be adapted for houses from the grand to the modest. The picturesque presented, in Pevsner's words, the fancy dress ball of architecture. It offered a repertoire from which a client could choose according to his own taste, informing himself from the plethora of architectural pattern books or villa books which disseminated these novel designs. But in addition, the idea of harmony between house and setting embodied within the picturesque also came to be highly influential in the layout of the speculative new suburbs and resorts which sprang up on the fringes of the burgeoning towns of late Georgian Britain. And this perhaps was the most enduring legacy of the architectural picturesque. While it was a Georgian innovation, it extended a huge influence over the design of the middle-class home for the remainder of the 19th century and perhaps beyond. If you're not familiar with the picturesque and would like to know more, the following 4 books are good starting points. First, the late and much missed David Watkin's The English Vision, which is a masterful but elegant study. Christopher Hussey's The Picturesque, Studies in a Point of View, which when published in 1927 was a pioneering work on the aesthetics of Romanticism across a number of disciplines. English Heritage's John Nash, Architect of the Picturesque, edited by Dr. Geoffrey Tyack, is a collection of essays on Nash's own interpretation of the genre in architecture and urban planning. And last, John MacArthur's The Picturesque, Architecture Discussed and Other Irregularities, is a more lateral and thought-provoking examination of the architectural picturesque, past and present. Much food for thought on a complex subject.